President Trump has expedited the deportation of over 1,000 children since March, sending them back to the dangerous countries which they fled. The Trump administration is justifying this as an attempt to fight the spread of COVID-19. Here with me to explain what's really behind this is Norissa Santa Cruz. She's a writer for the World Socialist website, and she's also running for vice president in the US 2020 elections as a member of the Socialist Equality Party. Norissa, who are these children and why are they being deported during a global pandemic?
These children are, many of them, unaccompanied minors, and they are seeking asylum in the U.S. They've been deported primarily to Mexico and very dangerous countries in the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. They have fled what are very dangerous conditions. Many of them have been beaten, physically abused, raped, have parents and loved ones who've been killed, and they themselves have experienced death threats. So what's significant about what's happening is that the Trump administration is basically using a law from the 1940s to give the president sweeping powers during a health crisis to basically overrule and tear up any last protections that unaccompanied minors who are seeking asylum once had. So, previously under these anti-trafficking laws, unaccompanied minors would be able to come to the U.S. and basically enter into the care of the Department of Health and Human Services, not to be detained for more than 20 days, and should then enter into the care of a guardian or family member. So basically, the Trump administration is using the pandemic to undermine these laws that protect them. And so this is actually presented, as you say, as being a response to the crisis. But in fact, the Trump administration's laws prohibiting immigration, the travel bans, and these exacerbated deportations are actually policies that have been long prepared by the Trump administration. Many of them have been constructed by a group of fascists in the White House. The Trump administration policy on immigration is actually led by his advisor, Stephen Miller, who is a known neo-Nazi and white supremacist. This is, basically a matter of public record. And Miller has been actually trying for years now to use these health special powers that the president can assume under a health crisis in order to undermine immigration, particularly for children. Stephen Miller has basically seen, he and these other a group of anti-immigrant fascists in the White House have seen immigration and the protections of children, particularly, as a huge hurdle that needs to be overcome. So actually in 2019, Miller proposed that these powers be used during an outbreak of measles that basically spread across some 6 states, tried to use the president's healthcare powers to stop unaccompanied minors, and he tried the same thing later that year with a particularly aggressive flu season amongst the Border Patrol stations. So the main point is that these are long-standing anti-immigrant policies, and the pandemic is being used to push them through.
What has been the role of the Democratic Party in these attacks on immigrants? I saw Biden had tweeted his opposition to the deportations.
Yeah, the tweet from Biden is entirely cynical. The Democratic Party, particularly, under the Obama administration, Biden knows very well that some 3 million immigrants were deported. And it was under that administration where we saw a massive expansion of ICE, as well as where, most of the detention centers, these horrific jails, in which there's squalid conditions, cramped conditions. They're known by children as ice boxes. Actually, 7 children have died in these facilities in the last few years. These were constructed under the Obama administration, as well as horrific policies such as detention bed quota system. It was basically a federal mandate from Obama that said that every day 40,000 detention center beds have to be filled. Not only was this an anti-immigration policy, but it was an open handout to the for-profit jail systems. So the Democratic Party is completely hostile to immigrants. So Biden's campaign is cynical. At the same time, his presidential campaign is being, led on an anti-China line. He is posing himself and his campaign as being harder on China than Trump. A recent ad from his campaign basically chides Trump for allowing in some 40,000 Chinese immigrants. So we're seeing a rise in xenophobia and racism and nationalism that is coming from both the Trump administration, on the one hand, referring to the virus as a Chinese virus, and on the other hand, Biden's anti-China campaign. And what it's leading to are horrific instances of hate crimes. There was a recent reporting that some 1,700 hate crimes against Asian Americans were reported in just the last few months. So that is the fruit of the anti-China virulence by both the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign, and also the really horrific history against immigrants by the Democratic Party. One other point that I'd like to make is that what we're seeing in this back to work drive that both the Trump administration is pursuing, as well as the Democratic Party and the ruling elites throughout the world, this homicidal drive to push workers back into factories, meatpacking plants, farm workers, transit workers. This homicidal campaign fundamentally threatens the very right to life. Both immigrants and workers, native born, are really faced with the question of the fundamental right to life.
This is, of course, a global pandemic we're talking about, bringing disease, death, and social crisis to workers all over the world. What is the situation in the Latin American countries to which these children are being deported?
In many cases, such as in Guatemala, for instance, half of Guatemala's reported cases are actually detainees who've been deported from the U.S. to Guatemala, and it's a health crisis. The local populations are terrified. All of these governments are very similar in being entirely unable to respond to the pandemic. The healthcare systems are entirely overrun. and in Latin American countries, from Brazil to Peru, the situation is so dire and underreported that people are just dying in their homes without any medical care or in the crowded favelas. So the Trump administration sending planefuls of COVID positive detainees is definitely only exacerbating the system. But it also, on the other hand, shows the complete disdain, that the administration has towards immigrants who are already housed in these really squalid conditions in the detention centers in the U.S., where there's been outbreaks throughout many of them, to the point at which the immigrant detainees are waging hunger strikes and protests over the lack of protection.
So how can workers fight against this? You're running for U.S. Vice President. What is the Socialist Equality Party calling for in response to the pandemic?
The response by the ruling classes in the U.S. and throughout the world has been what we're referring to as a completely homicidal policy that is essentially guaranteeing that millions across the globe are going to become infected and die from this pandemic. So, the only viable solution is internationalism and the fight for socialism. We're calling on the unification of workers and young people in the US and throughout the world to organize and fight together to prevent the spread of this disease, to build rank and file factory workplace committees, at workplaces and schools and universities to use the highest level of scientific knowledge that we know about this pandemic and the disease to ensure the safety of their loved ones, their family members, and their international brothers and sisters. This has to be a global and unified response. And it's also bound up with the fight for socialism. I mean, the main kind of question that has to be asked moving forward, is who is going to run society? Is it going to be the Jeff Bezos and, Elon Musk's who are throwing workers back onto the front line, pushing them back to work, and at the same time splashing about in the profits that they're making from this thing? Will it be them who run this society, the financial oligarchy, or will it be the international working class who organizes together to guarantee health and safety for the world's masses of people? So, this is really the question at hand, and this is what our campaign represents: internationalism and the fight for socialism to put an end to this pandemic.
Well, thank you very much, Norissa.
Thank you so much, Zach, for having me.
To find out more about the campaign of Joseph Kishore and Norissa Santa Cruz for U.S. President and Vice President, visit their website at socialism2020.org. They are the candidates of the Socialist Equality Party.